Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here this morning. I'm really happy to be here to talk about the program, and I look forward to our discussion period following the presentation. So I am director of the office at EPA that's responsible for implementing the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is a very challenging and fulfilling job, but we do have our work cut out for us in terms of trying to have a robust and credible chemicals management program and assure chemical safety, and I'll talk about those challenges a little bit. This slide talks a little bit about some of the issues that we've identified with TSCA, and particularly as part of the ongoing dialogue about the need for TSCA reform, and the administration's support of TSCA reform and principles for TSCA reform. But I'm going to take a minute because I think we probably here in the room and out there with folks participating in the webinar maybe have some people who are very familiar with the Toxic Substances Control Act and maybe some folks who are less familiar. So I want to talk a little bit about that. The act was implemented in 1976. I think back then it was a very ambitious statute. I think it, reflected the science and the policy of the time. It essentially, and the coverage of TSCA is not unlike the coverage that we were just discussing for REACH. Pesticides are excluded, food, drug, and cosmetics are excluded. There's some other particular categories of chemicals that are excluded, but beyond those, generally chemicals that are used in the industrial context or the commercial context or in most consumer products are covered by TSCA. TSCA sort of set up, again, dividing chemicals into two universes, those that were existing at the time the statute was passed and implemented, and then new chemicals that came on the market after that. So after passage of the statute, one of the first things that the agency did was collect information to compile an inventory of chemicals that were in commerce back in the late 70s. And that those chemicals numbered about 60,000 chemicals. After that inventory was completed, any chemical that was subject to TSCA jurisdiction that was not on that inventory of existing chemicals had to come through our new chemicals program. TSCA requires a pre-manufacture review of chemicals. A company that wants to market a chemical has to notify us that they intend to do that at least 90 days before the chemical goes on the market. There are a few things that they're required to tell us about the chemical, but they are not required to generate toxicity data in order to submit a pre-manufacture notice to the agency. They're required to give us any information that they have in their possession at the time of the notification, but not to generate any information. So EPA developed and has continued to develop over time an approach to evaluating new chemicals that relies on structure activity analysis, quantitative structure activity analysis, modeling, both on the toxicity side, on the exposure side, that allows us to conduct the review of new chemicals. Again, the companies are required to notify us 90 days before they manufacture. Unless EPA takes action to prevent that, once the 90 days expire, companies can go ahead and commence manufacture of that substance. To take action to affect the manufacture of a chemical for which we have some concern, the burden is on the agency to show either that a chemical may present an unreasonable risk, which is the safety standard under TSCA, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So we have to make a case for toxicity and exposure, or that the chemical may be produced in substantial volumes and that there may be substantial exposure. So the burden's on the agency to make that finding. If we make that finding, we then have authorities in the new chemicals program, which is Section 5 of TSCA, to require testing of the new chemical substance and can put in place restrictions, risk reduction provisions to while that testing is being developed. And we can do that by administrative order. Most of the actions that we've taken since the beginning of the program have actually been via consent order that we negotiate with the companies that are submitting the notifications. And then sometime after, in the 80s, after the program had been in place for a while, we also started to routinely issue significant new use rules for those chemicals where we had consent orders, because the consent order applies only to the company providing the notification. Once a chemical goes on the inventory, even though it's subject to restrictions for the original company, those restrictions wouldn't apply to other companies. So we then put a rule in place that would have those similar restrictions apply to any other company that wanted to proceed with manufacturing that chemical. So since we started the new chemicals program, there are over 20,000 new chemicals that have come through that new chemicals review process and have been added to the inventory. So we're now looking at over 80,000 chemicals that are on the TSCA inventory. And we've actually reviewed about twice that many pre-manufacturer notifications or other new chemical notifications. Only about half of the notifications we review actually end up being commercialized for various reasons. Companies decide not to pursue them. Sometimes I think because we raise issues about them and so forth. But that's the new chemical side of the universe. For the existing chemical side, which were those 60,000 some chemicals that were identified back in the late 1970s, there is no mandatory review process under TSCA. TSCA gives us some authorities to collect data on chemicals about production volume and use and so forth. And we do now have in place the chemical data reporting rule, where we periodically, every 4 years, collect information on a subset of the chemicals that are part of the existing chemicals universe. TSCA also gives us some authority through rulemaking to require testing of existing chemicals. Again, there are findings that EPA needs to make to require that testing. And over the 30-plus years of TSCA, I think we've required testing. It's a little bit over 200 chemicals now for which we've required testing. But it is a rulemaking process. We go through notice and comment. We go through the executive order reviews. So it's a fairly lengthy process. You know, you're usually looking at something like 5 years to get the final rule in place on average. It's taken longer in some cases, less in other cases, but 5 years to get the rule in place, and then you start the process of developing the data. The data come in depending on the testing, some number of years after that, and then you have the review of the data. So it's not what you'd call a really responsive process. That's kind of a quick tour of the new and existing chemicals program. There are other reporting requirements. There is a requirement that if there's testing that shows significant risk, companies do have to, for an existing chemical, a new chemical, it can even be a research and development chemical, companies are required to notify us of that study if they have done it and it shows significant risk. Those are some of the primary sections, but during the Q&A I can answer other questions. One thing I will mention, it's up on this slide, there are also provisions in TSCA for protection of confidential business information, and those are important provisions in sort of protecting proprietary interest in chemicals. We have heard, and I believe this to be true, that particularly in the area of new chemicals where innovation is going on, there is a societal interest in protecting the value of that information. But we have also found that because the agency was not always requiring that those claims of confidentiality be substantiated, or that they weren't being revisited years later after a chemical may have been on the market for decades, that there were a lot of things that were being kept confidential that perhaps really didn't merit that protection. So a number of years ago, about 5 years ago, we started a program to really focus on trying to identify unwarranted claims of confidentiality so that we could get more of the information that we have collected under TSCA out in the public domain. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when you look at some of the issues around TSCA, they really flow from some of the things that I have talked about. And I think the biggest issue is that there's no mandatory program to review those existing chemicals. And as you know, anybody who's been in Washington for any time, I think, and maybe outside of Washington would tell you, if there isn't a mandate to get it done, it's often not going to get done because you are, you know, at the back of the line behind statutory deadlines for policy level attention, for budget attention, and that sort of thing. If it's not mandatory, it's not likely to get done, and that is one of the things that we have struggled with. I guess the other thing I'll mention is where we have done reviews of existing chemicals over time, the tools that we have to then address any risks that we identify for those chemicals are very challenging. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, the agency attempted to use its regulatory authorities for existing chemicals under TSCA for asbestos to try to ban a number of uses of asbestos. I think the agency spent something like 10 years and many, many millions of dollars compiling the case to do that. And once the final rule was issued, it was challenged, and it was, for the most part, overturned because the court found that despite the fact that we were talking about asbestos, despite the fact that there was a very, you know, large record compiled for that case, that we still had not met the cost-benefit requirements for banning products containing asbestos, that we had not met requirements of demonstrating that we had looked at every potential use of asbestos and for every potential use had identified all of the alternatives, alternative approaches to regulations, what the alternatives to asbestos were in all of those different products, and that the agency had not made the case that we were taking the least burdensome approach to dealing with those products containing asbestos. So essentially, up until that asbestos rule, the agency had used its existing chemical regulatory authority 5 times for a number of chemicals, so through the 1980s. After that asbestos situation, we haven't used it. So from the early 90s until 2013. So I'll try to quickly run through my other slides in terms of what we're currently doing in the agency with our implementation of TSCA. And essentially, we have 3 interrelated components of the program that we're pursuing now. Risk assessment and risk management. This is where we are trying to strengthen and revitalize and build basically a program to assess and manage existing chemicals. But frankly, you know, we're able to, even with the big push there, we're able to look at, you know, maybe 5 to 10 chemicals a year doing the full risk assessment, and then where we find risk, we intend to move to risk management. So clearly, that sort of pace is not going to get us where we want to be or where I think the country wants us to be on chemicals management. So we are also looking at ways to promote the development of safer chemicals, and part of that is providing access to data. This talks a little bit about criteria that we use to identify chemicals that we're doing risk management on, prioritization, and again, we can talk about this some more when we get to, but I think we use criteria that we conducted a stakeholder process, and these are similar criteria to what I think what our colleagues in other countries are working with as well. And we announced a list of 83 chemicals for which we're doing risk management. We issued 4 draft risk assessments earlier this year. We'll be issuing additional ones, and we're going through peer review on those draft risk assessments right now. Access to data, I think, is very important for both the risk assessment, risk management side and the safer chemical side. I talked about what we're doing on confidential business information. Also in September, we released a new chemical information portal that we will be building over time, but we're very excited about it. And it's basically, the website is epa.gov/chemview. And we have data on over 1,000 chemicals in there now, different data that we have collected under TSCA, and we will be working over the coming years to add information in there. Our goal is to basically have everything in there by 2017. Promoting safer chemicals. We have two programs, a green chemistry program that promotes the development of safer chemicals, and the sort of our crown jewel there is the Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Awards. And we have our Design for the Environment program that recognizes products that contain safer chemicals. And we have a very robust set of criteria that we use to evaluate chemicals. Companies making products who want to get our Design for the Environment label develop a dossier and submit it to a third party for review. And if it passes that review, it comes to the agency for recognition. And we've got, I don't know, we're getting close to 3,000 products that we've recognized there. And then about a year ago, we also took the chemicals that were in those recognized products and separately listed them on a safer chemical ingredients list, so that if by functional class, so that if someone is looking for a chemical that meets a functional need that we have recognized as a safer chemical, they can look to that list. And so we are also working separately to encourage folks to submit chemicals to be included on that safer chemical ingredient list. So sorry, I've run a little bit over my time, but I look forward to more discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Wendy. So next up, to provide the NGO perspective is Dr. Richard Dennison. Dr. Dennison is a senior scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he's been there for 27 years, with experience in the environmental arena, specializing in policy, hazard and risk assessment, and management for industrial chemicals and nanomaterials. He has testified before various congressional committees on the need for fundamental reform of U.S. policy towards industrial chemicals and nanomaterial safety research. Dr. Dennison is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology, and its Standing Committee on Emerging Science for Environmental Health Decisions. Welcome, Richard.